Well, I'm very excited about doing this portrait. I had a dream about this image, and I've done a fair amount of life drawing and also some portrait work from life, and as well as some things from photographs that I've taken after someone sat for a while, and then I continue in the studio to do the work from the photos I've taken. But in this case, I'm working from a dream and an image that came to me. So I looked up a number of facial images in the direction of what I had been seeing in my dream. And I worked from about 5 different photos, and my knowledge of and bust work that I've done in portrait classes over the years. So anyway, this is the image that has come out, and I'm going to take some Aurelian yellow, and in the areas where the light is facing to the left, I'm going to assume that whatever light there is coming from the left. And so I'm going to put a little bit of that yellow in the areas that might be hit by the light. And I'll leave some areas without any color at this point, but some yellow light in some areas. So this is the way I'm going to approach this, with the first glaze of soft, transparent Aurelian yellow. It's also called, in some cases, cobalt yellow, but generally referred to as Aurelian. It's spelled, let's see how it's spelled. I don't have the spelling right here handy, but it's one of the most transparent yellows. I like the idea of perhaps also brightening that up a little bit with an Indian yellow in a few places, and dropping in some Indian yellow in some transition areas that might have color that is a little more deep. And then using some water to mix that a little bit with the lighter yellow. I'm not using yellow ochre because it's more opaque, and I prefer to stay with the transparent colors at this point. Leaving some without any color. I'm going to remove a little bit or blend down a little bit of color here and there. So it's very, very subtle. Now the next color that I want to go to is to bring in some transparent rose. And what I'm going to use is a rose madder, which is very, very transparent. It's a good first glaze color. And I'm going to let some of that actually blend over the yellow and mix, and some of that go into the shadow a little bit. Okay. Rather than mix my skin color in the mixing tray with the combination of a pinkish tone and a yellow tone, I prefer to take the approach of letting them mix on the paper, and that way you get a diversity in the color. So I'm beginning to go into some shadow areas with that rose madder, just putting some of that in some shadow areas. Transitioning to the shadow gradually, and it'll be more of a rose, less color as we move into the shadow, and the next glaze will bring some of that shadow into a more violet tone. There'll be a little more shadow here under the nose and over here and there. And just take some water and soften that edge and blend that down. Leave that area alone for a while. Now I'm going to take a cobalt blue and make a very transparent, cobalt blue is in this tone here. Make it very transparent and bring it into the shadow area of the face. And lightly drop a little bit of that into the hairline area and let that blend in with some of that rose, and let's be a little bit blend in with some of the rose. Not so much with the yellow because we don't want to make a green. But here's some rose here, and let that blend in with the blue in the shadow areas of the face, which are away from the light. This whole ear will be in shadow. Okay. Now we're going to do basically the same thing. Move down to the chin, the neck area, and on the side toward the light in the lower part of the neck, there will be some of that soft yellows, a little bit mixing the Indian yellow and which is sort of like a closer to a yellow ochre, but it's transparent, whereas the yellow ochre would not be. And I could use a cadmium yellow if I used plenty of water, but I prefer not to use any of the colors that are opaque, and all the cadmium colors are opaque. So then as I move up the neck and it moves more into shadow, we have one of our deepest shadows under the face, which is putting this entire area here into shadow. So I'm going to put in that rose madder again, that transparent rose, and let some of it drop in and mix with the yellow that's there. And already there's a beginning of a skin tone with that. And that might be all a little too dark. I can lift a little color out. Make sure that it doesn't. I lift a little color out with my paper towel and also some damp water on my brush. Yeah, it's a little better. Oh, sorry about the puppy noises. Okay, and then I'm going to take again some of that cobalt blue and drop it into the rose madder over here in the furthest area. Those are little play bark noises. Those are the puppies that were born in October. So they're very, very young. I'm just blotting out a little bit of color so it's not too much color at this point. So there you have a beginning that is showing the basic structure of this portrait. I'll put a little bit of blue down here because there's a fairly deep shadow there. And again, I'll blend that in with drawing my brush a bit on my paper towel. And just blend that down. Take a tiny bit of that blue and put that over here. There's a shadow here. At the crevice of the eye. And I'll put a little tiny bit under the eyebrow here. And there'll be a little bit under the eyebrow here and in the crevice there. So this is a very thin and light wash. And a little more, I'll put a little more of that cobalt blue, which is one of the nice things about the cobalt blue is not only is it fairly transparent, none of the blues are fully transparent, but it's fairly transparent and it doesn't granulate. So it's a good skin color because it doesn't granulate and create texture, which we don't want skin to look like it's textured grass or something. You know, it's some of the other blues are really wonderful for landscape, and cobalt can be used in landscape, but for portraits, you do want to pick a blue that is a non-granulating blue. For most skins, especially a skin like this, which is a very smooth young woman's skin, regardless of what color she is eventually. We can create skin color in the final layers that is either African color or Native American color or more Asian color by the glazing of a final glaze that will bring out the cast of that color, whether it's a little more brown or violet or a little more red or a little more yellow. That can be done as we go along. There are different ways of doing the portraiture, and in some ways, one way, this is just one way, where we glaze with the red, yellow, and blue, whichever red, yellow, and blue we choose. We glaze on the white paper. Or we can mix the skin colors and put the skin color in light in some areas and darker in other areas to make the shadows. So there's different ways to approach it. Another way to approach the process is to actually just paint the middle and darker level values in a kind of neutral, and then put skin color over that. So today we're just going to illustrate this method, which is glazing with the colors that we want to begin to make the skin color. I don't yet know what kind of sky I'm going to create around this image, and I haven't really decided what color hair she will have, but I'm just going to take a little bit of burnt sienna and create the beginning of some hair color. So she can be brunette, she can be red-haired, but I just want to show a little bit the shape of her hair, which is softly pulled back into a kind of bun. And I'll take a little bit of that new gamboge color that I used on the skin, and we'll have some highlights with that in the yellow. And I'll take a little bit of a similar kind of tone and just put a little bit of that lightly to remind myself that this is where my eyebrows are. Okay. And I don't think I'm going to make her have dark brown eyes, and I don't think I'm going to make her have blue eyes. I think they might be a hazel. So I'm just going to put a very light, soft brownish tone there, which I'll go over with later to indicate that they're hazel. And I'm going to take my permanent rose color and with a little smaller brush. Right now I've been using a number 8 Talon Mix Goat. Talon Mix Goat. So it's Taklon Mix Goat. So it's goat and some synthetic. And I'm going to take a number 2 synthetic, which is a smaller brush in a Skoda Versatile. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that rose madder and put some in the shadow of this lip here where it curves and it's got some shadow. So I'm showing that there. lightly going to put that same color a little lighter above. And I'm just going to blend some of that very, very light, more water, adding more water. I don't want it to be too pink. But then I'll take a little bit of that gamboge and drop a little bit of that in because it's a little too pink. Yeah. So that's the beginning of that face. I'm going to take now I'm just going to build up a few more shadows, and then I'm going to have to let it fully dry. So to build up a few more shadows, I'm going to take those same three colors. I'm going to mix them together until I feel like I have a color that begins to approximate a kind of skin color. So it would have a tiny bit of blue, a little more yellow than blue, and a little more rose than blue. So we have the smallest amount of blue to get a color that begins to approximate skin. Now that looks like African American skin at this point on the on the mixing tray, but in fact I'll put a little more rose in. It's a matter of how much water you put in. So I can make that very, very subtle. And what I'm doing is I'm beginning to put a more normal skin tone in some of these areas. Leaving some of the color below showing here and there, but I'll go to a little bigger brush again. Plenty of water. I just want a little bit I want to tone down some of these shadow colors so that they are more in the skin tone range, but the blue will still be showing through. It all will dry lighter, but this will create a diversity in the skin, and you'll see some of the color below showing through. Everything will dry a lighter tone. Very light wash here. I need to lift and blend that a bit there. And again, I'm going to just tone down this color under the neck by using this overlay skin color that I've created, and that will pull that all together while still letting the red, yellow, and blue show through. So it's a very, very thin, watery wash that is just going over most of the skin color, and yet still allowing the underlying colors, the base coat, to show through, leaving some areas with some highlights. You can always dab a little bit off if you think you've gone too far with the color, because we can come back and still put this kind of layer on again if we need to. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of blue, mix it with the burnt sienna to get a neutral, and bring in some shadow colors here in the hair. Just very lightly, not too much. So that's the cobalt blue mixed with a tiny bit of burnt sienna to create some, along the hairline, some sense of the shadows in the hairline as the hair is softly pulled away from the face. And then some hair over here in shadow. And I'm still undecided what final color that will have, but I'm thinking that it'll probably be maybe like a dark auburn or brunette. But at this point, I still can decide a little bit later. Okay. I think that's a good place to let this dry. And because this is too wet to really build in some definitive shadows at this point. One of the things I could do is take a little bit of blue and a tiny bit of green and a tiny bit of yellow, and see if I can make a hazel color that looks nice to me. Not there yet. Not there. Still. Maybe that's about right. A little bit of a hazel color. Still not quite right. A little more blue. A little more yellow. Yeah, that's more of a hazel color, because I already put a soft amount of brown there. And I'm just going to go very, very lightly in this area here. not filling in the area completely, but just focusing on a little bit of color on the outer areas of the iris, leaving a little bit of white for now in the center so that I can later decide where I want to put any reflection or additional marks, but this is a start, the beginning of the hazel eyes. Okay, that's about all we can do until this dries. So let's see how dark it is when it dries. Hopefully it will dry a fair amount lighter than it looks right now, but we'll see then. Take care. Okay, this is now completely dry, and I think that this color here is looking pretty good. And so what I want to do is create a color that is a little bit toward an orange. So I'm going to take some normal scarlet and some Aurelian yellow. And make a soft orangey color, because it's got a little bit too much of a bluish cast now that I see that it's dry. And I'm just going to take that, need a little more water, and put on another layer of color in some areas where I'd like to bring in a little more warmth. So I'll just do that here and there. Not everywhere. Just put in a few places where I want to make this just a little more of a glow, a warmer glow. In some of the bluish areas. Some of the areas that are bluish and in shadow, a little warmer glow. And then I'm going to do, take some of the red and mix it with the cobalt blue and make a bit of a violet. I think you can see the colors on my mixing tray. And over the blue, now that's a little too dark, but I'll just put a little more water in that and blend a little bit of that violet over the shadow, deepening the shadow a bit in those shadow colors, in those shadow areas. A little warmer tone, that warmer tone there underneath, and I'm going to put some of that warm tone on the neck again, not everywhere, and some of the violet in what would be the area of deepest shadow, and blend that down, mixed with some of the warm as you come down. some of the warm. And I'm actually leaving some little areas uncovered. Dabbing to let some of those under areas show through, because I'm wanting a little bit of that blend of top layer and lower layer to be showing. Here I got my jawline. I'm going to leave my jawline fairly defined for now. I'm going to come in later and probably make that more defined later. A little more along the hairline and taking some of that shadow off into the hair actually. So there are lost edges. Maybe carrying a little bit of it here and there into the shadow here, because the violet is a good shadow color. Okay, so this is ready to sit again, for me to look at it carefully, put a little bit of the violet under the lip where there's a dark shadow, and here in the opening between the lips where they're parted, and a little bit underneath this top lip, carefully under the, it's a little bit hard for me to get my brush around without putting my arm in front. And I'll have a little bit of that violet shadow here, a little bit under the nose, and a little bit under the eyebrow over here. A touch, not very much, but a little bit in the crevice of the eye under the eyebrow over here, and under the eye a little bit, and in the crevice of the eyelid here. I'm going to carry that down a little bit. And I'll take it down just a little bit on the nose. Now I'm going to put, deepen that violet just a touch. I'm just having a little less water, a little more blue, and put a little bit darker over here. And a little bit darker in the extreme shadow area over here, under the jaw. And now down a bit into the marks of the ear. And then with a damp brush that I've just cleaned, just damp, washed, and then wiped with my paper towel so it's damp, just soften the edges a little bit so that the transition is not wet between there. And a little bit over here under the jaw again, where there's more shadow. And then blending it down with some of that warmer color. Okay. I have to let this I have to let this dry a little bit again. I'm going to put the slightest amount of shadow over here on the nose. Wrapping around the nose and taking the warmer color and blending it a little bit. So there's some little bit slightly darker violet. Right there where the nose flares. And then blending softly. Okay. A little more here while it's still wet. And softening those edges again. By wiping my brush on my damp paper towel and getting some of the water away and blending it in. Okay. Very short additional segment. It needs to dry again. I could use the hair dryer, but instead I'll just let it dry naturally and turn off the, I prefer to just let it dry naturally, then use the hair dryer and come back to it. But when we do this in class, we'll use a hair dryer to get the whole portrait done within the class. And there's no reason not to use the hair dryer. If it was very, 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 very wet, I wouldn't want to use the hair dryer because it would blow the paint around. But this is barely, this is just damp, not very, very wet. So I could easily use a hair dryer, and I'm just gradually building up the color in order to look at it each time and make sure that it's not overdone. Now this is a good time for me also to just kind of quickly see what color to make the hair. So I think I'll take a little bit of burnt sienna and mix it with a little bit of rose madder. I think you can see that color. So it's a little bit of burnt sienna mixing with rose madder. And plenty of water. I'm just going to create some overline, leaving some areas untouched, but a little bit of overline glaze as to make this the beginning. I'm glazing over the yellow. Creating some shadows near where the hood is above. everything is more in shadow. But leaving some areas untouched. Beginning to get a sense that this might be auburn hair. A few areas a little more intense that are in shadow. That's it. That's good for now. We don't want the hair to be too overworked with detail. Just having these glazes of color in there. Let's have a sense that this might be auburn hair. But you still have the glow of the yellow below in some places and the white highlights. Okay. I think that's okay for now. We'll let this dry some more. Okay. Before moving forward with more layers of skin. It is dry now, and so it's got a pretty good color. I will make some changes in a final set of layers, but this is a good time to put in some details, and then you'll see that when you have some details, so I've zoned in a little bit more to the painting. Let's see how much to zone in. Yeah, that's probably a pretty good amount. I'm going to work a little bit on the hazel of the eyes, and I'm going to, on my mixing tray, I'm once again going to put in some cobalt blue. And I'm going to put in a little bit of, this time a little bit of New Gamboge yellow. It's just a darker yellow. I think that's making a pretty nice hazily look. And at this point, I've already put some color, excuse me. I just went outside to feed the horses. It's kind of cold out there. Just put some, earlier I put some of this greenish color in here. But now I'm just going to take a little bit and right under the eyelid, make it a little bit darker, because it's in the shadow of the eyelid. So you see there's just a tiny bit of shadow, and here again in the iris, make a little bit of darker up at the top. And then as I go around, you always have these little lines. If you look closely at your own eyes, there are these little tiny lines, and I'm using them to create some diversity in the eye. Okay. But not fully fill the space. So I'm going to leave that for now and come back to it and do the pupil next. The next thing I want to do is to take some Van Dyke brown, which is a fairly dark brown, make a nice mixture there. And I'm going to put a little bit of that rose madder in it. Because that looks like a pretty good color for working on my eyebrow. And again, I don't want to make this solid because it would just be such a distraction to have it be a big solid line across the bottom of her forehead. So I'm just putting in some marks and leaving some of the color below showing through, so it's still going to be a fairly filled in space, not a lot of white, but it's going to be varied because of course with all the hairs on the eyebrow it is varied, and I don't want it so solid and dark that it's a distraction. But at the same time, I'm not trying to show hairs, I'm just trying to show diversity of color. And toward the end here, I'm just going to make it soft and watered down here. And toward the bottom, a little bit watered down and soft, and make some soft edges, not solid edges. Okay, what we say, we want some lost edges. All right? And I'll make some lost edges here. She's going to have a fairly strong eyebrow. And there's always a little bit of a crevice here, even on the young. As we get older, we have these crevices from concern and facial expression. They get a little bit bigger, but I'm just showing a little bit of crevice there. So let's see if I get it just the right amount of darkness in that corner. Maybe a few hairs coming out here and there. I don't know if you could hear that furnace just shut off. I have the original, and I'm going to put a little bit of dark cobalt blue in here and make some of this down here in this deeper part of the eyebrow a little darker and in shadow. Okay. So I was saying I have the original furnace in this house from 1968. And I recently had it tested, and surprisingly, they found it was about 85% efficient, whereas the new furnaces are about 88% efficient. So that's pretty good. I was happy to hear that. Sorry about that. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. We don't see as much of the eyebrow on the other side, so I'm just going to put some darker bluish brown marks there. I'm still not happy with this one, the way it's looking. Put a little more blue here, see if I can get this bottom part of the front of the eyebrow where it's really most in shadow, just a little more sunken in there. Good. And then I'm going to carry some of that blue into the space here, and again make the edges a little lost, and I'm going to carry it a little bit into the eyelid, the same bluish brown. Okay. To begin to define that. I don't want it a line all the way across, but to begin to define that eyelid and also the lid below and a little shadow underneath and some shadow over here, remember. And lost a little bit of water to blend some of those edges. And in this crevice over here, again, a little bit of the lower lash line and a little bit of the eyelid, the lower eyelid. And do the same over here, showing a little bit of the eyelid in that bluish color, bluish brown, mixture of Van Dyke brown and cobalt blue. Okay. We'll let that dry a little bit. We'll take some more cobalt blue, again with the Van Dyke brown. Make a dark, see that dark neutral? That's a very dark neutral, darker than the last one. The same two colors, but more blue, more burnt sienna, less water. I want to do this nostril. And underneath a little bit of the nose, the shadow. And a tiny bit in this crevice here, the shadow. And in this one, I'm just wetting, again drying my brush. This is a number 2 Escoda synthetic brush. There. Put a little more here. I don't want to overdo it, but a little bit of line of the eyelid here. Good. A little bit more of the eyelid in here. A little bit more here. And a little bit more of the lid there. And I've got some eyelashes that I'll show now. You don't want to show the eyelashes too early, because if you do and then you're trying to put washes in those same areas, then you'll just get everything running together and making a bit of a mess. And since this is a nice dark neutral, I'm going to put it in this little space here where she's pouting a tiny bit. And there, the lips are slightly parted. And then in the line between the lips, and then where the lips join the cheek, a little bit of shadow. And I'll use that same dark, mixing, I think you can see. Let me hold it up a little bit more of the color. That same dark, which is the Van Dyke brown in the blue, and making this space under the lip in shadow. And then I take my brush with water and blend that. There. And I like this dark to continue under the chin. It's a nice dark Van Dyke brown. And cobalt blue. It's a nice brown to really deepen the shadow under the face. And while we have that nice brown, I'll put a little more blue in it. Now you see, I'm going to take it over here and create finally this little shadow that one sees in the ear, with the rim of the ear and the whole of the ear, and then a little bit of indentation here. I'm going to leave it just like that, nothing more. And here, under the ear, and right under the ear and behind the jawline, I'm going to make a little more dark shadow and carry that down and let it blend with water. This is very step by step, looking and seeing what could be needed now. And since this is a nice dark thing, I want a little bit of the hair furthest away from the light. I'm going to drop down some individual hairs. Because I think if you're feeling like you're done with your face part, I'm just going to put some hairs, some loose hairs. And put in a little bit of indication of hairs here and there. Not too many, just a little bit. Now you don't want to do this until you feel like your face is pretty well close to being done, because otherwise you can't really come back and easily rework some of that. But I think I've got my face close to being, the skin close to being done. I'm just putting in some marks now, some darker marks. I'm not sure I have the final hair color, but I'm close. And I'm wanting to put some shadows in here and there, in the hair, under the hood. Okay, now, put a slight amount of rose madder on my mixing tray again. And I'm going to add the slightest amount of any yellow at all to make it a little less pink and a little more, slightly more orange, and put some of that here in this upper lip and at the base of the lower lip. And one of the things I want to do is also take some of that color and bring it down into this area here. Just highlight that cheekbone just a bit more. And then blend. Okay. Now the next step, see, you don't want it entirely smooth because then the eye can make up for what it's seeing, and anything that's too smooth, then when there's an area that's not exactly right. Now I'm going to take a very dark black or Payne's gray. Let's go more with the black. And do the front section of the pupil. You see that? I don't want to just color a big circle in because there's always a little bit of different color because it's a circle. It's a little ball. The eyeball is really a ball. And as a ball, it has a tendency to have a little bit of a small area of light showing. You don't want it to be too obvious, but a little bit. Just like there's a little bit of light down in here. I'll take a little more of this green that we mixed, this hazel, and carried a little more. Now, one of the things that's really important is that there's no such thing as a completely white eyeball. It's very distracting. So we take a tiny bit of the cobalt blue and add a lot of water and put that very blue wash in the corners of the eye. Okay? Because the eyeball has a shape and it curves and it's never completely bright white. Bright white eyeball would be a bit of a distraction. So you see that? There's a tiny bit of white here and there, but not completely. And then the other thing that happens, you take some of that rose madder there is always a small amount of red in the crevice of the eye. So you just put the smallest amount in there. All right? And here a little more, intensify a little more if you need to, the rose madder. Yeah. So we haven't changed the skin very much. As you can see in this stage, that rose madder and yellow mixture, I'm going to put a little bit on the bottom of this earlobe, because often that earlobe just has a little bit of brightness to it. So the next step is to paint a bit around the face before doing anything more on the face, because the face will be defined by the colors around it. And if we make the face, if we try to finish it now and then put in the background, we may feel that it doesn't quite look right. So again, I'm going to take the cobalt blue, but it's not deep enough. So I'm going to take the ultramarine blue, which is much deeper, and it also is granulated. It granulates. So I'm going to take quite a lot of that and put that on my mixing tray. Okay? And then I'm going to take a small amount of burnt sienna and put that in there. Now both burnt sienna and ultramarine blue are granulating. And when they are mixed together, they can make a nice amount of texture. So I'm going to paint this side of my hood with that mixture. And I don't need to make it very dark. I have to be careful that I don't put it next to any wet paint where it could bleed in. Okay. But I'm creating my hood. And I'll work just in one area at a time. I'll work in this area right now. Okay. And what I'm going to do is take some blue by itself, some of the ultramarine blue, and put it into an area where I knew there was shadow in the cape. And where the color would be a little darker. And I'll take some of the lighter cobalt blue and put that up in this area here that is in light, more light. Because we do know that the light is coming from this side. Whether it's from the moon or it's from the sun, we haven't decided. That depends on the choice of sky that you have. I'm planning on a bit of an evening sky, perhaps with a moon in it and some clouds. So there I have the beginning of the cape. And I am going to put some violet in my cape. Let that bleed in. And some of the, I'll put in some Van Dyke black, brown, dropping it in. down here, I'll put some of the Van Dyke brown dropping into the blue, letting them mix together in this wet on wet kind of technique, okay? And going into the darker areas of the blue. So that's one side of the cape. The cape's hood. Give that a little bit of time. All I'm going to do now is just smooth out that one place where I don't have color and I need color in order to make sure there's not a discontinuity in the lines here. So I want to just finish this section of the cape, which is, yeah, so that the colors all blend together without any problem while they're wet. And then I'll take a little bit more of the Van Dyke black brown and slip it in here. And Van Dyke, any brown, when mixed with blue, creates a neutral. And when I mix the blue with the burnt sienna, it's a warmer neutral. And when I mix it with the Van Dyke brown, it's a little cooler and darker neutral. So I'm bringing some of that in here to really get a sense of the hood of the cape billowing and turning while it's wet. And over here, a little bit, again, while it's very, very wet, I'm going to drop in a little more of that Van Dyke brown. I could use black in there to darken, but I like the idea that this is a warmer color, a brown, rather than a black. A little more violet to create some diversity in the blue. I've got a little hair here I've got to pick up. Okay, good. And up at the top, I need that line to be smoothed out a little bit. Although when I put in the sky, I can probably solve that edge. Okay, so there we have one side of the cape. Now, I don't want to do the other side until this has a chance to dry a bit, because I don't want to reach over in front of the camera and smudge, take the chance of smudging. So for now, I'm just going to work down in this area on this side. Put a little bit of the cobalt blue in this. It's more in the light, it's a little brighter. Yeah. Okay, so I think this is a good place for us to stop the camera again for a little while, let everything dry, and come back to it. I think, let me just move it out so I realize that I've zoomed in a little too much. You can't see everything, so there you can see the violet that I put in there. This is a little bit more of a magenta than a normal dark violet. It's a reddish violet. But if you don't have a reddish violet, if you don't have a magenta on your palette, you can also just mix some alizarin crimson with whatever violet you have, and then you'll get a little bit more of a rosy magenta. But that just creates a sense of turning and also a little diversity in the color. I like the idea of putting that magenta in here a little bit too. Again, anytime you put in an alizarin crimson or a red, you get a sense of turning. And I don't want this hood to be one great big blob of one color. I like the idea that it will look like it has some diversity as it bends and shapes in different directions in the unusual light outdoors. Yeah, that's not bad. Okay, so we've got the beginning of a hood. We can always go back and do a little more detail in the face, but we'll wait until we have the hood, because the hood so frames the face that it actually will change your perception of the skin color with the hood around it. You'll have it'll look different, and maybe it'll look more pale in comparison to the hood. Once we finish the hood, and we may have to deepen it because of the intensity of the hood, so and the darkness of the hood. So let's just we'll be patient about the skin color. Right now the skin color looks very good, but it looks very good on a white background, and it may be that it needs to have a little bit more intensity once we. In the blue of the hood, we may need it to be a little more rosy. Whereas if we had a red hood, we may need it to be a little more deep in a different way, or more bright, more yellow. So we'll see. Once the surrounding color is finished and we dry it, we look at it, then we can decide. It's best not to plan too much, because the watercolor is never an exact thing. It has its own way of interacting with the paper. I'm going to put a little dark shoulder down here, mixing again that Van Dyke brown, but putting very little water in it and making it very dark. Just want to show, while we're over on this side of the painting, just want to show some shoulder. There. Okay. After this is dried, we'll revisit it. Okay, it's still drying, but I'm ready to do something in the. I'm ready to take some black or Payne's gray, but let's take some black, add some water to it. So this is an ivory black. And I'm going to use this same color over here, but now I'm going to use my little gadget that helps me to put my hand without touching the paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this color, but not make it too dark, here in the shadow inner part of the hood. And then after that dries, I will glaze over with the same mixture that's on the other side. But I want to put a thin layer of the black down first. So that automatically when I put on the blue mixture over that, it will appear to be in shadow. So I don't want it too heavy. Seems to be a little hair here. Pick that up. I use some water to blend this. There's another little hair here. Some of these colors on my palette, they get dusty and little bits of hairs in them now and then. Some of them I don't use very often. I don't use black very often, so that's probably why it's got had a little dirt in it. And very carefully, all of this skin is dry, so I don't have to worry about it bleeding into that area. I want to be careful here because the hood is wet, and I don't want it to bleed in the hood, so I'll leave a little space. Yeah. So I'm just making that watered down black, and it becomes a bit of a gray. And then when I put the blue over it, it will make that blue look like it's just in shadow. Of course, I could have just mixed the black with the blue, but I like the idea of doing it this way and showing you this technique as well. This technique, by the way, we can even use in doing portraits by laying down in the shadow areas this watery wash of a gray. Can be made either from Payne's gray or any neutral tint, or any neutral at all. But can do the shadows like here and in the crevices of the eye and everything, go over the whole thing with a gray. And then you can paint all your skin above that, having that underlying wash of shadow. There is an artist who does most of his portraits that way. And some artists do their landscapes that way too, creating that underlying wash of gray to show their value contrast, and then painting the colors above that. And it does have the benefit of creating a sort of harmonizing gray throughout the painting for the shadow. There's another little piece of lint or something. There, there's one there. Okay, yeah. So I'll leave that for now. And the other thing that I might do for now, remember I did this dark shadow here? I'll use that same color for the other shoulder. Even though that shoulder is a little more in light, I won't worry about that right now. I'll just indicate that shoulder. And I'll slightly indicate that there's a bow here of the fabric in the way that they used to make these cloaks back in olden times, with these large billowing hoods. So I'm just going to indicate there's a bow there. And then I'll come in, paint that later, and do all the blues later. But to me, watercolor is an exercise in patience. Being willing to give the time to the paint for it to dry, and also taking the time to look at it in different lights: nighttime, daytime, indoors, outdoors, getting a sense of what is needed next, and not, since you really can't correct very easily in watercolor, not like you can with oils and acrylics. So it requires a certain amount of patience. I'm going to make it a little more intense in here, in the inner part of the hood where it would be a little darker. Just do that now, because then I won't have to do it later when putting on the blue. Just showing that. It's a little bit darker in there, in that space. Okay. Add a little bit up in this space here too, under the hood. Just looking to see where is the light coming from and which parts would be most in shadow and a little darker. It's a little uneven there, so I don't want that. Okay, I'll just let that dry and come back to it after a little bit. I hope you're enjoying this. I do love doing portraits, and this image has been haunting me, and I've been really wanting to paint it for the past week, when I woke up and I saw it so clearly in my mind. So, time to do it. There are a number of artists who get their painting ideas from their dreams, and they write down all their dreams. But Edison also, he got a lot of his invention ideas from his dreams. So, when our dreams do speak to us, we should listen. I don't want to carry that darkness all the way to the eye. Just leave a little bit of lightness near the eye. Blending it out, drying it, my brush, and blending that out. Okay, I think that's about as much as I can do. Just trying to make it all even as much as I can. All right, we'll revisit this again after it's completely dry. Okay, it's time to put the deeper shade in here. And just as we did before, we'll mix together some brown. Use the burnt sienna to start. And some ultramarine blue. Make a dark blue tone. And I'm going to put that in the into this area here, which has already been painted gray. And we should be able to get a nice dark that is the same basic color as the rest of the hood, but toned down by the undercoat of black. So let's see here. I'll just put this color in. I'm looking at the edges first here. Careful about my edges here. I've got some eyelashes there. I don't want to, and some skin I don't want to cover. I have to be careful about that. But then I can use some water and blend in that inner area. Because it doesn't have, it's better if it's not just a solid mass of color. So, I want to get pretty close to that nose there, not leave any white spots between the dark and the nose. Good, that's good. Fortunately, this brush, it's an Escoda synthetic, so it has a nice point that it keeps and doesn't really bend. The point doesn't really bend, not like a soft sable. So it's good for this kind of work. And so even though it's a fairly good size brush, it doesn't have a mark on it, but I think it's around a 6, between a 6 and an 8. So it's sort of my go-to brush because it is a good intermediate size. I'm going to blend this a little more, but you can see how that underlying tone of gray that was created by a wash of just black and Payne's gray has created a nice base for this second coat. And I'm going to put a little more. This one I made a little darker. I put some Van Dyke brown in with the ultramarine blue, as well as the cobalt blue. Make it a little deeper in that crevice area here, where it's furthest from the light. Okay. Again, I'm going to carry this down close to the skin